Okay, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about the peak of the Middle Ages, which is a period of time that scholars call the High Middle Ages. This was a time of a lot of innovation, a lot of change within medieval Europe, and so it actually precedes a quite disastrous period of time in European history, but all of these events and all of these circumstances and all of these developments are going to lead up to the Renaissance. So it's really important to get a good understanding of the context of this time period because it helps to understand the later Renaissance and the developments that occurred in that time period as well. Okay, a key component of understanding this time period is understanding how social organization worked, how society was organized, and how classes were divided. And we have a couple of sources from the time period that give us an idea of at least how people who were contemporary to this time period understood social organization. The first passage that I'm going to quote to you was by a man, a bishop named Adalbero of Leon, and he wrote, "Here below some pray, others fight, still others work." Another passage that we find from this time period, which is around the beginning of the 11th century, I should mention, was written by Gerard of Cambrai. He wrote, "From the beginning, mankind has been divided into three parts, among men of prayer, farmers, and men of war." It's really interesting. Scholars now talk about these as the three orders, and the pyramid that you can see lays out how this worked. Now, the image of a tripartite society divided by function has become a hallmark of medieval European history. And I think that understanding this tripartite division of European society that occurred during the High Middle Ages is really important both for our understanding of medieval European history, but also for the subsequent history of the continent. So, for example, it's going to help us to understand the developments during the Black Plague and the Renaissance, and even into the 18th century. In particular, we will see this come into play during the French Revolution. If you decide to take Western Civilizations 2, the second semester, you will see how important this theory of social organization figures in that conflict. It was during that century, the 18th century, that the Ancien Régime, which roughly translates to the old regime, faced its gravest challenge during the days of the French Revolution. One of the first things the revolutionaries abolished was feudalism. And feudalism, I use that term loosely because there really is no uniform system of feudalism in Europe, but scholars will talk about it as a way of having organized society. And I do believe we've already discussed that in our week during which we spoke about the Carolingians. So as these revolutionaries abolished feudalism, they also were attempting to abolish the remnants of a society that was based on status and prestige. This is a society that was based on the division of orders according to one's function, those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. And you can see from the pyramid that those who pray would have been the clergy, and they were responsible for praying for the community. Each of these roles has an integral role in preserving the stability of society. And so for the clergy, that meant that they prayed for the spiritual well-being. They prayed for God's favor. They prayed for the protection of their communities. In times of conflict, they prayed that God would save them, and so on and so forth. There were lots of reasons to pray, but they had an integral role in preserving the spiritual well-being of the community. And then we have those who fight, the bellatores. These would be the nobility. And it was their responsibility to protect the community. And you can see that as European society was becoming increasingly violent, why this would be such an important role to play. Because people needed to be protected. And so there's really an important role for the nobility in protecting society by fighting wars, by defending communities, defending lands. And then the third division of society were the laboratores. And these are Latin terms, in case you were wondering. But these are the people who work, and we know them as the peasants. This is the peasant class of people, and it was approximately 80% of the population that supported all of society. And so it was their job to provide for food and goods. And so that was their contribution to the stability of society. And each of these three divisions, these people, the theory went that everybody had their role to play, and when everybody worked together and did what they were supposed to do, what God had meant for them to do, then society would function well and there would be peace and prosperity. Okay, so we're going to focus this week primarily on the commercial, urban, and agricultural revolutions, as well as changes in education. We're going to see the development of a much more sophisticated university system and the development of scholasticism. So that's primarily what we're going to focus on this week. As Europe entered the new millennium, so we're talking in the 11th century, at the beginning of the 11th century, Europe experienced a quickening of trade, innovation, agriculture, artistic and literary achievement, and really much, much more. There are important factors that contributed to this growth, and these factors were in turn driving each other. So, for example, this is a time period that experienced better climate conditions, and those good climate conditions led to more availability of food. Lots more crops were being produced. With more food, there was population growth, and that in turn drove the need for agricultural innovations that could accommodate the growing of more food. So we see the development of a three-field system. We see new irrigation methods. We see the development of the heavy plow, which allowed more land that was previously unavailable to be farmed. With a heavy plow, they could plow up those soils that were too heavy to plow by hand. And so this led to an increase in the availability of arable land. And as agricultural got more efficient and more effective, this led to more food and so forth. And so we see that more food led to population growth. More population growth led to the need for more food. And we see innovation all wrapped up in this. And this is just an example of how that worked. And we see this in many different aspects of European society, that we see this cycle of need and innovation. There are some consequences to this. Particularly when we're talking about agriculture and these innovations in agriculture and this higher availability of food, but also population pressure. And some of those consequences were that we had higher food prices in Europe. We also have a decline in serfdom. We see much less serfdom. We see the linkages. We see how people were tied to the land. Those ties are being severed, and so people are becoming more mobile. Now, we also see the development of new commercial centers. Markets were associated with particular places, and these markets were used for regular weekly meetings to sell goods. This was common practice. We also see fairs. Fairs were often specialized, and they could last days or even weeks. And they drew traders from longer distances and took place once a year. So this could be an annual thing or a biannual thing, and it was broadcast about that there would be this fair. And so you would have traders show up to participate in that. And so this is further driving a greater commercialization of Europe. Through taxes and tolls on merchants, fairs produce substantial revenues for towns. And so what we see happening is the development of these permanent commercial centers in towns and cities. And they often developed around castles or monasteries. So these are towns that are building around places that are already seen as social centers, as places of public gathering. As great lords in the countryside increasingly accepted money payments instead of services and dues from their peasants, they also had more money available to foster the development of markets and fairs. This further encouraged trade and settlement in these areas, and so we see the development of these large urban areas being driven by the need for a place to trade. So, I'd like to include some discussion about minority groups, for example, the Jews. Many long-distance traders were Italians and Jews. Italians and Jews were very involved in long-distance trade, and they often mediated that. They supplied things like fine wine, spices, and fabrics that weren't produced in Europe. Italians took up these trades because of the geographic opportunities and urbanization that was occurring throughout Europe. Some Mediterranean Jews had been involved in commerce since Roman times. Jews in Northern Europe were often driven off their land, however, as political power fragmented. This meant that they relocated to towns or cities where some became moneylenders and financiers. Jews in cities often had an ambiguous status. They were not recognized as citizens, and they were often excluded from oath-based Christian craft organizations or the government. They had their own institutions and synagogues, and they often lived voluntarily segregated in a Jewish quarter. They participated in a shared economy with Christians as consumers, traders, and moneylenders, which is really interesting because we do see some divisions that are beginning to occur between Christians and Jewish populations. But those divisions aren't happening overnight. They're developing over time. But during this period of time, we do see an integral role for Jewish populations in European society. Now, many marketplace towns were actually unplanned, and they just happened. And they included marketplaces, often a castle, and several churches. Remember, a castle was really important to the defense of a community. Population, in turn, increased dramatically, as we've already discussed. An accompanying building boom provided greater housing in these urban areas. And we also see specialized buildings for trade and city government, and we see expanded walls in some of these towns. Networks of often narrow and dark streets were made of parked clay or gravel. These weren't the greatest roads, but they were still better than rutted, muddy roads. And we see waterways being used as well. And waterways actually accelerated the development of towns and became part of a single interdependent economy. They became very important for transportation of goods, especially because road situations could be a little bit tenuous. So those urban centers that were located on rivers benefited the most from these developments in new networks of trade. So this is really a great map, and it shows some of those trade routes that were developing in this time period throughout Europe. So these are, you can see from the map that these are trade routes from the 11th and 12th centuries. And we see land trade routes. They would be the ones from my screen it looks a little pink, a little fuchsia. But we also see water trade routes. Those would be the routes in blue. And so you can see how being connected to water in some way or having some kind of proximity to a water route had some significance for the development of these urban centers. The further inland you get, for example, up into what's now Eastern Germany, Poland, some of these areas, while they did still have trade going on, it's not as condensed. It's not as urbanized, and so that has significance. So just, it's an interesting map and gives you an idea of where that trade is occurring and how important trade was to the development of these urban centers. Okay, and so this is an example of a community and what that might have looked like. So these are the walls of Piacenza in Italy. This would have been a commune, and we're going to talk about communes a bit. But you can see that this community had pockets of tradesmen and craftsmen in these areas, and so what you tended to have developing is these little sub-communities that were dedicated to a particular component of trade, some kind of craft. And so in the orange you can see these different pockets of textile makers, and in the green you can see that there were smiths, so blacksmiths. And I would suspect that you would see wheelwrights and people of those types of trades in these areas as well. And then in the blue you have leather workers. The interesting thing about this is that you can see that the leather workers are kind of off a little bit by themselves. It wouldn't have been a great thing to live around those who practiced the trade of leatherworking, because the process was a really smelly one, and it was really kind of nasty to be around. And so you shouldn't be surprised to see that they were a little bit off to the side in some of these areas. Certainly anybody who lived around those areas these are probably going to be the poorer classes. You're not going to see anybody from the aristocracy or the nobility or even the clergy living around these particular tradesmen. And then in yellow, you can see fishermen, kiln workers, and shipwrights, and as you would expect, they would be located closer to the river. So it's just an interesting way of looking at how society was structured in this particular community, and very much driven by occupation. All right. So there was a really important form of organization in medieval society called the guilds, and you may already have heard of guilds. We're going to talk about these a little bit. Medieval industry was really highly organized, principally through guilds. These were a kind of club for crafts and tradespeople, and so they would be organized around a particular type of occupation. You would have a guild, especially for the practitioners of that occupation. These were originally religious or charitable associations. They were a way of coming together and supporting one another. And they evolved into professional corporations with statutes, rules, and dues that set standards within a trade and controlled membership. And so at times they could even become so organized and so tightly controlling of a particular industry that they somewhat monopolized that industry as a guild. They would set prices and determine quality of goods, things like that. Guilds often cooperated in making goods, and they were hierarchical, with masters and journeymen supervising apprentices. Masters set guild policies, and they served as officers. Now, this might be familiar to some of you who are perhaps in a trade-oriented course of study, because this is still a form of organization that we see in many of the trades. A new range of business agreements brought people and resources together to finance larger commercial initiatives, and these efforts were actually the ancestors of modern-day capitalism. Contracts for sales, exchanges, and loans became much more common. We also see that church bans on interest or usury led to contracts designed to circumvent them. The use of loans to finance businesses signaled a changed attitude toward credit. Risk was acceptable if it brought profit. This is a change in the way that people think about trade. The growth of contracts and partnerships made large-scale productive enterprises easier to establish and finance. So this is in turn furthering it's continuing to promote growth. Light industry began in the 11th century, centering on cloth production. So we see some centers throughout Europe that are focused very much on cloth production. For example, England became known for its production of wool cloth. Water mills provided some power, and deep mining technology also allowed for more exploitation of raw materials. And we also see that the manufacture of iron tools made farming more efficient. So all around, we see lots of innovation occurring that is that is spurring growth in trade and commerce. So life in a medieval city probably wasn't the most comfortable existence that you could possibly have. Most medieval cities were surrounded by stone walls, and they were really prone to fire. Fire was a very common thing. Most buildings, while some buildings would have been stone, most buildings would have been built of wood, and with everybody burning fires in their homes and what little light people had being provided by forms of fire, this meant that cities experienced a lot of fire. It was also a place that had a lot of artisans and a lot of trade, and so this was a center of production. Water could often be really kind of disgusting. It was heavily polluted because any of those remains of manufacturing would have been dumped into water supplies. These are cities that didn't have great sanitation systems, and so there was sewage, lots of sewage in the streets. Trash was often dumped in the streets. Like I said, this was not a great existence. It wasn't the most pleasant place. Cities in this time period were often described as being really smelly, and so as you can imagine, these would have been centers of quite a bit of disease. So fire, disease, filth, lots of dirt, lots of pollution. It was really kind of gross. And on top of that, people, when they did bathe, they tended to do so in public baths. But you can imagine that for some societies, there wasn't a lot of bathing going on. This wasn't something that you did every night before you went to bed. So, like I said, it could be rather unpleasant. Now, what we see happening with the development of these medieval urban centers, this is going to change this threefold social division that I've talked about in the beginning: those who pray, those who fight, and those who worked. Because urban dwellers with their specialized occupations don't fit as neatly into those old categories. And in fact, townspeople developed a real sense of solidarity, a real sense of community identity, and they had particular economic and political needs. Townspeople had a sense of independence from servile dues and service, and they sought their own officials and law courts. So we see a lot of innovation in legal codes that are occurring during this time period. Communes, these were town institutions of self-government. They actually developed as legal corporate bodies so that towns could govern themselves. Now, communes were most common in Italy, France, and Flanders. This is where you're going to see communes mostly centered. In Italy, cities were centers of political activity and were filled with tradespeople that were interested in self-governance. Urban independence movements were sometimes really violent, but many towns gained a measure of self-rule. And so we will often see these towns, there will be some citizenship status that goes along with it, and there would be residential requirements that went along with it. So you would have to have lived in a place for a certain amount of time before you were eligible to be a citizen of a commune. So it's just really interesting development in the political and social structure of these towns. There's not anything like it. We haven't seen anything like this. This is a new development. Now, by 1150, rural life was increasingly organized around the marketplace, as we've seen. This brought new opportunities and obligations to both peasants and lords. As economic pressures on the rural aristocracy increased, this meant that the aristocracy sought to increase their wealth and prestige by becoming integrated into the commercial economy. So instead of relying on those old sources of income, we're going to see the aristocracy starting to move into these more commercial interests. Lords hired trained, literate agents to administer their estates, and these agents often were put to work calculating profits and losses and making marketing decisions. Population increase and rising demand for food led to efforts to cultivate new land, particularly in Flanders. Most of these efforts were sponsored by the nobility, but sometimes, as in England's Venland region, free peasants worked to reclaim land on their own. Some peasants banded together and established rural communes. Integration into a money economy benefited peasants in a number of ways. Rising prices made their fixed rents less onerous, and better access to markets allowed them to sell their surplus production for cash, which they could then spend on other goods. In some cases, peasants also gained personal freedom from their lords. However, cash obligations also increased. So just as with everything, there's a pro and a con to every new development. Now, for peasants, life was determined by the seasons, and so the bulk of the work was done during warm periods, and during the winter, this was a period of relative downtime. The calendar revolved around religious feast days and the church, and so we see that a lot of peasants actually had a lot of time off for feast days, because feast days, you didn't do work on those days. And so social life revolved around the church for many peasants. Most peasants lived in wooden cottages. They lived rather simple lifestyles with rather simple diets. But what's interesting about their diet is that it very much relied on, the few sources of meat that they were able to get, maybe a pig, maybe a sheep. There wasn't a lot of access to cattle, and that probably would have been reserved for people who were wealthier. But you might be able to raise a pig. Oftentimes what would happen is that peasants would have sort of some common woods and would allow pigs to subsist on whatever they could find in the woods. And then when fall came, you would butcher the pig. So that was a common thing. Peasants didn't eat a lot of butter or dairy products. Those were usually sold at market because they brought good money into the household. But peasants also gathered a lot. They grew foods, and so they had a diet that was very reliant on vegetable products. So a lot of beans, some cheaper grains. Probably not wheat, but maybe barley would have been something that a peasant ate. Peasants ate a lot. They ate bread. Bread was a key component of their diet as well. And so what's interesting about this is that if you were wealthy, you could, of course, afford a lot of meat. It was seen as a status symbol, being able to have a diet rich in meat. But this also led to some nutritional difficulties. And so we see a lot of gout among the wealthy. It's kind of interesting. So in reality, peasants probably had a more healthier diet than the nobility. The nobility often had some really, they had some difficult health concerns that were brought on by diets that were rich in meat and fats. But peasants, if they got enough food, were probably eating very good food. But that was the question. Could they get enough food? So when peasants had a difficult time getting a good diet, it was because they lacked sufficient food, not necessarily that they lacked good food. They also drank a lot. When I was a graduate student, I took a course in popular religions, and popular religions is this idea that in Europe, the way that most people practice their religion could very often differ from the formal practice of a religion. And so we see a lot of, in popular religions, we see a lot of mixture of, maybe forms of worship that have roots in a pagan past intermixed with these more formal rituals of the church. But part of this course, we talked quite a bit about daily lives of peasants, and I remember reading an article that stated that for most, this particular scholar, and I apologize for not having the name of that scholar in front of me, but this particular scholar sort of, took information that he could find from the documentary evidence and put it together and came to the conclusion that most people, most of their lives, walked around in a state of drunkenness because they drank so much alcohol. As I discussed a little bit earlier in the development of towns, because water became so polluted, it was really unsafe to drink water for the most part. And so even if you drank water, you always put alcohol in it first to sterilize the water, to make it safe to drink. But on top of that, alcohol was a really efficient way to store grains and not have to worry about spoilage, not have to worry about rodents getting into your grain. And so grains were often stored in the form of alcohol. And so people drank a lot. And even children would have been exposed to very watered down quantities of alcohol as a result of this. Now, the lives of women, in family life, as I said, peasants would have lived in wooden cottages for the most part, and these cottages meant that for most peasants they had limited privacy. My kids, I remember when we moved into our second home, it was a bigger home than we'd been living in, and there was some argument over who was going to get what room, and it was just really interesting to see them kind of wrestle over which room was the biggest and all of that. And some of you may have had similar experiences with your own children, or maybe this was your experience as a teenager as well. But for most peasants, privacy was a non-issue because you just didn't have any. Families slept in the same room that they lived in. And oftentimes they shared that room they could possibly share that room with some livestock as well. So this was a really interesting existence. Now, for women, as we've seen that for most women, depending on your class, if you were lower class, you tended to be more involved in economic activities. For the most part, for peasant women, their contribution to the household in terms of its economics was really vital to the family's survival. They didn't just bear children and manage households, but they were also working in the fields with their husbands. This was a very different lifestyle from aristocratic women. Aristocratic women remained largely under the control of men for all of their lives, but they were not quite as oppressed as you might think. There are numerous examples of women from these classes who exercise considerable power and influence, and some of those examples your book is giving you would be Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile. And so some scholars have kind of modified the way that they talk about and analyze the life of women during these time periods, because they really did have they did really exert more influence than we've become accustomed to thinking about women from the past. Okay, so among the aristocracy, we have some interesting developments, and I'm not going to go too much into this, but we have, even among the aristocracy, we have divisions of status. So we have a hierarchy among the aristocracy, and you'll notice from this list, so we have kings, which tended to be at the top, of course, that how much control a king had over his society varied. For example, in France, we're going to see that the French king didn't have a lot of power and influence. He really was a weak king. But in England, the king was rather strong and had more centralized power over his people, a lot more control over what occurred in his kingdom. And then we have some other divisions: dukes, counts, barons, viscounts. And notice that we have bishops and archbishops included. These were offices, these were positions within the church. But we count them as the aristocracy because they often came from the aristocracy. These were positions of prestige. And so we see the aristocracy, there are a lot of ties between the aristocracy and the upper echelons of the church. And so we include these offices because they were such prestigious offices to hold. Now, as you would expect, the aristocracy had a lot of land, and they exerted a lot of power in the various areas that throughout Europe. Land was power. This is going to change, of course, as commerce and trade become increasingly important. But the most successful members of the aristocracy are going to be those who can adapt, who can use their land and tie it to means of production and more efficient production. We also see the aristocracy developing this warrior culture. And so what I mean by the warrior culture is that we see this development of chivalry, which was a code of ethics for the nobility. It was a way of being, a way of behaving. Violence got so bad during the Middle Ages. Localized violence became so extreme, and so life could be a little bit tenuous. And in response to this, we see the development of this code of ethics called chivalry. What's going on here is that we see a lot of knights. We have a lot of young knights. So if you were the son of a nobleman or even just a wealthy landowner, you could become a knight. But if there wasn't a lot going on, if there weren't a lot of wars to fight, then you really didn't have much to do. As things became more prosperous, and this was a time period of peace, there were a lot of young knights that didn't have a lot to do, and this meant increased violence. Because what happens when teenage boys or even men in their 20s, and I apologize to anybody who might be offended by this, but whenever you have these large groups of young men who aren't occupied with something, we see in the Middle Ages that there were these outbreaks of violence, and oftentimes peasants were affected by this. They were essentially in the way, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and so they could be victimized by this. So there was a lot of violence, and so as a result, we see the development of chivalry, this code of ethics that dictated honor, virtue, things like that. And this was epitomized, you can see in the stories of King Arthur. These became very popular stories, and Sir Lancelot was the epitome of this code of ethics. We also see the development of tournaments as a way of diverting some of these young men into maybe some more productive expressions of their athleticism, I suppose is what you could call it. So this is kind of developing in response to what is still essentially a warrior culture, but it's a warrior culture that doesn't really have the avenues to express itself in the same way, because life is changing, things are different. And so it's just becoming different. Life in Europe is changing, and people are having to change with it. And so in response to that, Europeans are seeing a need to control some of these violent tendencies. Now, pressure for church reform increased as more people sought a church free of secular entanglements. This is increasingly becoming an issue. The Benedictine monastery of Cluny, which was established in 910 and endowed by the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine, was under the protection of the saints Peter and Paul through the Pope. It was renowned for its spiritual activity and prayer. It was a very famous monastery. Its abbots encouraged clerical celibacy and urged the laity to cease oppressing the poor. Their status and activity represented the reforming energy of the era. Now, some clerics in Germany and Italy, particularly in its commercial regions, began to condemn the use of practices that violated canon law. They were especially offended by clerical marriage, as well as by simony, which was the buying of church offices, and lay investiture, which was the practice of lay rulers installing clerics into their offices. They felt that this was the prerogative of the church, not of lay rulers. And these demands for reforms from these clerics began urging the use of canon law to reform the church. They were supported by Emperor Henry III, who appointed Leo IX as Pope to reform the church under his control. which is really interesting considering that you've got these calls for reform and this desire on the part of clerics throughout the church to kind of purge the amount of lay influence on the church itself, and yet you have Henry III who's appointing the Pope as a reformer. So just kind of a little bit of irony there. Leo expanded papal power by calling church councils. He also expanded canon law and urged church reform. This was part of his program. His efforts to reestablish papal control over the Eastern Church led to the Great Schism in 1054 between Constantinople and Rome. You see this really interesting battle that goes on between the Byzantines and between the Pope and Rome over who actually controls the church, who's actually in charge here, and they wind up excommunicating each other. Leo expanded papal power by I was going back in my notes a little bit. Leo's efforts to reform meant that he and his successors supported Norman efforts to conquer Sicily. So we have all these calls to reform, and Leo is getting involved in what might be considered secular matters. Sicily at the time was under Muslim control, and so when Leo gets involved in this episode, he actually invests, and I use that term loosely, invests the territory to Norman lords. The popes became more and more involved in military enterprises in Sicily and Spain as the Christian Reconquista of Spain intensified. And so, like I said, the Pope is becoming increasingly involved in more secular matters, and he's doing it by justifying the need to make these areas Christian. And so this is setting up kind of a political environment that we're going to see has important repercussions for Europe later on. Now, papal reform peaked during the papacy of Gregory VII. Gregory was known for, this is what his papacy was known for. He supported papal primacy. This was the supremacy of the Pope over the Church, particularly in regard to secular rulers. Gregory believed that the emperor was just another layman with no right to interfere in church matters. He was proud, he was ambitious, he was spiritually sincere, and he was single-minded. He sought to free the church from worldly influence, and he was opposed by Henry IV, as we should expect. Henry IV was the ruler of Germany and much of Italy, and saw Gregory's assertions as a threat to his own power. Henry saw the bishops that he appointed as the natural rulers of the church, and he opposed the new ideas of Gregory and the reformers. The investiture conflict began in 1075 over the appointment of the Archbishop of Milan and other Italian bishops. When Henry insisted on appointing these church offices, Gregory excommunicated him, and he authorized Henry's subjects and vassals to rebel against him. He told him, go ahead, do it. Henry is no longer the legitimate ruler. And you can imagine that for the princes, this was a great opportunity to undermine the control of the emperor over these regions. So faced with the threat of rebellion, Henry actually had to beg for forgiveness. And there's this great story about how Henry hears that Gregory is at this castle, and so Henry rides to this castle and puts on really humble clothing and kneels outside the walls of this castle and begs the Pope to forgive him. And Gregory has to agree. He has to agree because otherwise, what would that look like for the Pope not to agree to forgive somebody who was obviously penitent? And so On the face of it, it looks like Henry is giving in to Gregory. But in reality, both of these men are having to make concessions to one another. Now, even though Henry begged for forgiveness, tensions did not disappear. They actually continued. And Henry caused a rival pope, which historians have called the anti-pope, to be elected. Papal and imperial armies fought from 1077 to 1122 over who was actually going to be pope and over these different issues. Now, after both men's death, the Concordat of Worms in 1122 ended the conflict, at least for a time. Henry V gave up the authority to appoint clerical offices, although he continued to influence their election. The Concordat established the idea that secular and spiritual power could be separated. As the emperor was weakened, local princes and cities became more independent of imperial authority, and so we can see that there are some long-lasting impacts of this investiture conflict on the relationship between the church and between political entities, so church and state. There are some really long-lasting consequences. So just a quick little map to show you what areas we're talking about. In orange you can see the empire that we're talking about, Henry IV's empire. And you can see down in the bottom the areas, part of Sicily and that lower part of the Italian boot was under control of the Normans. Remember that they took these areas back from Muslims, and Henry IV the Pope gave these areas over to the Normans' control. So what did reform look like in the church? Church reform went deeper than the conflicts at the top of the church hierarchy. So the clerics weren't necessarily, yes, investiture was important, but this was more of an issue at the top. But down at local levels, there were other issues that clerics were primarily concerned with. The church overall became more systematic and disciplined as a result of reform. And an important dimension to this development had to do with the increasing emphasis on the sacraments. These are those really important rituals that were considered to be saving rituals. They were necessary for people's salvation. And these sacraments were seen by many as the means by which God's grace was brought to people. For example, the church increasingly regulated and stressed the spiritual significance of marriage. Prior to this, most people didn't get married in a church. Most people underwent these sort of very secular rituals. They varied from location to location, but they oftentimes were what you might call contracts between families that united two families with the marriage of these two people. This emphasis on sacraments within the church also emphasized the importance of the Eucharist. The Eucharist, if you'll recall, is that commemoration of the Last Supper of Jesus. And we also see an increasing emphasis on the celebration of Mass. Sacramental life highlighted the importance of the priest, and so priests are becoming increasingly important in communities. And there's a new emphasis on clerical discipline, particularly priestly celibacy. This reform was not promulgated in the Eastern Church. It's important to recognize that. And it was at odds with local practice in many places. So it didn't necessarily get immediately adopted everywhere. In fact, what we see is that at the local level, some priests and some laity resisted some of these reforms. They were seen by many as being necessary to purge corruption from the church, but we still see that in local areas that it was not adopted evenly. In fact, despite opposition, in 1123, the Pope proclaimed that all clerical marriages were invalid, and he largely succeeded in enforcing the rule. So from this action, we know that a lot of clerics were still openly marrying. And even after clerical marriages were declared invalid, there's still going to be a lot of clerics, and it's hard to say how many, but we're still going to find examples of clerics who had mistresses and families, even after they were no longer able to marry. As the popes consolidated canon law and established the curia, which was a kind of church court at Rome, the papal bureaucracy and accompanying financial apparatus grew through the 11th and 12th centuries. This expanded the power of the pope and attracted criticism of the system's growing cost. The pope, with his bureaucracy, law courts, and financial apparatus, had become a monarch. So not everybody's going to like this. Now, Benedictine monasteries, such as the monks of Cluny that we've already talked about, came under growing criticism for the elaborate and opulent character of their facilities, their liturgy, and their lifestyle. So a lot of these monasteries, if you recall, a lot of people, when they die, if they have a lot of property, we have a lot of monasteries being given gifts of property and money and art and things of that nature. And so a lot of these monasteries, because they have a lot of land and they have a lot of resources, are becoming really wealthy. And people are critical of this. In contrast to the Benedictine order, the Carthusian order was founded by Bruno of Cologne. They took vows of silence and lived as hermits and spent a lot of time copying manuscripts. The Carthusians grew slowly, but the Cistercian order founded by Saint Bernard expanded rapidly, beginning at Citeaux in Burgundy in 1112 with around 30 friends and relatives. By the mid-12th century, there were more than 300 Cistercian monasteries throughout Europe, so it spread rather rapidly, even though it only began with this core group of about 30 people. Cistercians accepted Benedict's rules, but they emphasized simplicity. Monasteries had 2 houses, one with lay brothers to perform labor, and a second dedicated to prayer. This is how they were structured. Their churches were all dedicated to Mary, and they emphasized God's feminine dimension and Jesus as approachable, human, and protective. Cistercian spirituality extended beyond their monasteries and influenced many, including Saint Anselm, whose theological works emphasized Jesus' humanity, the power of human charity to redeem, and the love between Christians. These were some of his views. Cistercian monasteries emphasized poverty, purity, work, and each monastic enclave possessed highly organized farms and grazing lands called granges. The estates and flocks of Cistercian monasteries yielded substantial profits. So despite having been founded in rebellion against the wealth of the commercial revolution, and as a response to criticism of some of these monasteries like Cluny that had a lot of facilities and a lot of wealth, the Cistercians actually became part of it. They became part of that system. Now, I want you to look at this. This is Cluny from the 12th century, and I want you to look at this and consider why historians consider this church to be the most opulent in medieval Europe. What about it suggests grandeur? What about it is awe-inspiring? So some of the things that you might notice is that it has very high ceilings. It has a large amount of seating. There are elaborate mosaics and lots of stained glass windows. All of these things come together to suggest grandeur. Stained glass in particular would have been quite expensive and laborious to create. These were quite labor-intensive pieces of art to produce. Now, how might this church have been off-putting for other monks? Other monks may have believed that the church was too opulent. We do know that some monks have this criticism about some of these monasteries. And oftentimes their criticisms would be along the lines of, grandeur like this is detracting. It's a distraction from piety. And it distracts from the purpose of monastic and religious life. It's not really conducive to living a simple life. These would have been the criticisms that you would have heard. So just to give you an idea of what a monastery might have looked like, its floor plan, we have the floor plan of a Cistercian monastery. And so if you recall, you have these two wings in which you have a wing for the lay brothers, and you have a part of the monastery that is dedicated to prayer. So just kind of take a look at it, and you can, of course, pause the video and just get an idea of how that was set up.